The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Burden of Proof. What is the default position? So today I want to spend some time talking about the burden of proof, and there are a number of reasons for this. It wasn't actually the video that I thought I would be doing today. But recently, the Atheist Community of Austin's monthly lecture series had a guest lecturer in who basically presented his case for why the burden of proof logic is wrong and argued in favor of other things. I'll get to the specifics of his claims later on, but in a recent debate, I had an opponent attempt to shift the burden of proof by claiming that theism should be the default position. And I can't count the number of conversations that I've had, and you may have had some as well, where somebody expresses this idea that this is what I believe and I am not going to change my mind until you prove me wrong, essentially establishing that any opposition to their idea must have a burden of proof associated with it, which it would, but that their view stands as a default or de facto position until the opposition has met a burden of proof. And that may actually not be the right way to do things. I'm an atheist in part because I'm a skeptic. I've evaluated the arguments and evidence for various claims about God, and I found that they have not lived up to their burden of proof. But what is the burden of proof? What do we mean by that? There are people who are criticizing it for not being capable of helping you solve a problem. Well, the burden of proof is not a decision-making tool. It is the framework around which we establish what a default position is on any claim. And from there, we begin to work about how much evidence and what quality of evidence should be required before belief is reasonably justified. Every single claim put forward carries with it a burden of proof. Some God exists. That claim carries a burden of proof. No gods exist. That claim carries a burden of proof. But there are a lot of subtleties that people get confused about when we start talking about where the default position should be and what kind of propositions we're going to address. Because the truth is, the burden of proof addresses individual, discrete propositions. It doesn't address dilemmas, except where we have specifically created two propositions that are all-inclusive and mutually exclusive, and where one of them might be assigned as a default position, that we accept this by default until the contradictory position has met its burden of proof. Now, some of this may be a little confusing or complicated, and I'll do what I can to explain it. But the burden of proof is important, and I've seen so much confusion about it from debate opponents and PhD economists and just conversations with friends and family that I thought it'd be a good idea if we'd take a quick look at it. So I started by pointing out that every claim carries with it a burden of proof. You start, your default position with respect to any claim is disbelief. You are not yet convinced of the proposition. This is confusing to some people because many times it feels like your default position when you first hear a claim is that you accept it. But I'd argue that what really happens is that your brain, as it processes the information of the claim, goes ahead and assigns some probability to it based on all of the other information you have about the world, about how big of a risk it is to accept this, about how truthful you think the person is. All of this happens perhaps not even consciously. You're not sitting here saying, someone just made a claim, let me think about this. We train our brains to be sort of reflexive, to rely on inference and induction, that this claim is similar to other claims we've heard, and we can make a very quick decision about it. But the default position is that you don't yet believe it. You may very quickly come to believe it, and you can believe something or become convinced of something for good reasons or bad reasons. If I say, hi, my name's Matt, your brain hears that, processes it, assigns a value to it. You're probably just going to accept it for a number of good reasons. The first one is that I'm clearly recognized as the expert on what I would call myself, or more accurately, what I would like you to call me. It doesn't matter that whether or not Matt is the official name that's on my birth certificate, the information that I'm conveying when I say, hi, my name is Matt, is, hi, I would like for you to refer to me as Matt. And you just accept that this is the case almost instantaneously. But until you've been presented with a proposition, considered it, even subconsciously, your default position is to reject it. For more complicated propositions that you have to think about, like, hey, there is a God, your default position is one of non-acceptance, as it is for any other claim. Now, you may very quickly just accept it based on other information, based on experiences you've had. You may have had certain feelings or impressions and say, oh yeah, this is consistent with it, and therefore I'm going to go ahead and accept that it's true. But the process of evaluating can be a lot more complex than that. And it may be that you say, I don't have enough information to conclude that this claim is reasonable for me to believe. And there are a number of things that we evaluate subconsciously and consciously when we're trying to figure out whether or not a claim is believable. And that's a separate issue from whether or not it's true. It may be, and I don't want to get it diverted into a philosophical discussion about whether or not truth is possible, but the truth may be a secondary issue. What we're talking about is whether or not it is reasonable for us to accept the proposition. Is this likely to be true? Is it probably true? Is this the sort of thing that believing that it were true makes my internal model of the world more likely to be consistent with the external model of the world? Is the person that I'm interacting with, are they generally truthful? What other beliefs do I currently hold that are consistent with this? What beliefs do I currently hold that are contradictory to this? Would I have to change those beliefs if I accept this one? And if the weighting of the number of beliefs that I might have to change is so high, I might continue to reject this one until the evidence for this overcomes the evidence for all of the competing claims that I already accept. You're carrying around biases. You're carrying around a prepackaged set of beliefs and a number of thought processes that led to those beliefs. What you believe is important because it informs your actions. And you can believe things for good reasons or bad reasons. It is in fact possible to be reasonably justified in believing something that is in fact false. Just as many people for many years believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system, the center of the universe. The observations and the information they had led sort of naturally to that kind of conclusion. And it would have been a reasonable position to hold. So there's a distinction between X is true and it is reasonable to believe that X is true or likely. And that can change as the information changes, which is why the scientific process recognizes the limitations of human knowledge, human understanding, recognize the limitations of our ability to explore. And instead of making pronouncements about truth, it offers tentative, probabilistic models about what we observe. And we hope that we can continue to make those models more and more accurate. But when you process a claim, the default position is to reject it. Why? And by reject, does that mean you accept the opposite? Let's take a look. So we've already pointed out that every claim has a burden of proof. But what we're really trying to do is make a decision between competing hypotheses about how the world works. And in order to do that, in order to have the cleanest, clearest evaluation, we need to address things as frequently as possible in terms of a true, proper dichotomy. Now, this confuses some people because we have sort of colloquialisms. People would say, what's a good example of a true dichotomy? And many times they would say, true or false. But that's not actually a true dichotomy. The most accurate dichotomy would be true and not true, which may or may not mean that it's false. The easiest way to ensure that you have a true dichotomy is to insert a not, a negation, the not word, and it needs to be positioned properly. Because, for example, if I say, I believe a God exists, you could try to negate that by saying, I believe a God does not exist. And that would certainly be a contradictory position, but that is not the all-inclusive position about belief. By putting the not after God addressing the proposition exists, you're not negating the full proposition that we presented in the first place, which is, I believe a God exists. The correct dichotomy construction for that is I believe a God exists and I do not believe a God exists, because believe is where we begin the proposition. Believe a God exists, you either believe it or you do not believe it. That's a separate issue from whether a God exists or no God exists. So we've made the proposition here about belief. It is true that either a God exists or it doesn't exist. But what you believe about those two propositions is not limited to accepting one of the two. You could, in fact, reject either of them. And this is why when we go into propositional logic, we address a single proposition and evaluate that. The argument is constructed around this proposition, not two competing propositions, or three, or four, or five. And so we construct it so that the two that we're looking at as individual propositions are all-inclusive and mutually exclusive. But we only address them individually with regard to acceptance. Some God exists, you could believe that or not believe it. No gods exist, you could believe that or not believe it. And you can believe that X is true, X is not true, or you can in fact reject both of the claims. This is why people try to argue about a middle ground that they might call agnosticism, because they're talking about a middle ground between two claims, which really is the rejection of both claims, both the positive and negative claims in this contradictory position. But if we're evaluating a single claim, there is no middle ground. You either believe or you do not believe. Those are direct logical negations. So if the proposition is some God exists, you either believe it or you don't. There's no middle ground between direct logical negations. When we're evaluating a particular claim, what we're doing is trying to figure out not whether or not it is in fact true. We're not trying to gain absolute certainty, which may in fact be impossible, about the truth value of it. What we're trying to do is determine, do we have good reason to believe that this is true or probably true? We have to do that for each individual proposition. Some God exists, no God exists. The number of gumballs is even, the number of gumballs is odd. The defendant is in fact guilty or the defendant is in fact not guilty. Those are the negations that we evaluate. But when we're trying to decide between two propositions, which is what we do normally, obviously both of them have a burden of proof, but there may in fact be a default position between the two of them. And it might be that what we're talking about is something very much like the null hypothesis. So what is the null hypothesis? Generally speaking, it's the default position between competing hypotheses. The null hypothesis is generally the one that cannot be proved to be true, whether because of our own limitations of capabilities of what we can investigate, or the limitations of our knowledge, or what may be epistemologically possible. In order to prove a null hypothesis true, you would need, generally speaking, exhaustive knowledge of everything. And recognizing that this isn't the case, we begin with the null hypothesis, provided that the null hypothesis is one that can be falsified, something that can be shown to be false. And the way you do that is by demonstrating that a competing hypothesis is in fact true, or that it's reasonable to believe that it's true. The null hypothesis is that the supernatural doesn't exist. That's not a declaration that the supernatural does not exist. It's a declaration that the default position is to assume that the supernatural doesn't exist until such time as it's true, or demonstrated to be true, or reasonable to believe that the supernatural does exist. The default, the null hypothesis is that playing cards don't cause diabetes, that chipmunks don't come from an alternate universe. These are the things that may be impossible to prove true, but they could in fact be shown to be not true by demonstrating a competing hypothesis, by showing, hey, this is how the origins of chipmunks, and they fit into the evolutionary framework, and we build a big structure that shows that, yeah, the most reasonable conclusion is that they evolved right here on Earth and did not most likely come from another competing universe. The way to demonstrate that playing cards don't cause diabetes, that the null hypothesis that they don't cause diabetes is in fact false, is to show that they do cause diabetes, that there is a strong correlation supported by evidence properly tested to show that there's a correlation between playing cards and diabetes. The null hypothesis is a default position between competing hypotheses, and it's born of the recognition that there is a limit to our ability to investigate and prove certain things, that we're blocked from proving certain things. It is also a matter of recognizing that we don't have any good reason yet to believe that this is in fact the case. If we're going to talk about between competing propositions where the default is, we have to recognize that in some cases there is no default between propositions. The gumball example that I've used before, if you have a jar full of gumballs, the number of whole gumballs in there is either even or odd. But absent any information to show you which of those two propositions is more likely, there's no null hypothesis between those two. But the default position is to, as I said before, reject both those claims as not yet established. You don't have enough information to decide between the two of them, and you don't believe the number is even, and you don't believe the number is odd. You should believe that the number must in fact be either even or odd, because those are the only two possibilities. But you are not yet convinced that the number is in fact even, or likely, more likely even, or that the number is in fact odd or more likely odd, because you don't have enough information. So between those two propositions, there is no default. Occasionally I get emails from people saying, maybe we should just stop using the word belief. Knowledge is what matters. Beliefs don't matter. Or belief's such a fuzzy thing and people don't often offer the justification for their belief. So I don't believe anything. Well, that's hogwash. You do believe things. We all believe things. Belief merely means that you are convinced that a proposition is true or likely to be true. Knowledge is kind of vague. Philosophers have been arguing about how do we determine knowledge, how much does knowledge count for? And quite honestly, as I've pointed out, I think most of the time when people talk about knowing something, what they're doing is expressing a level of confidence in their beliefs. Knowledge is a subset of belief. Philosophically, it has often been defined as justified true belief. That particular definition has a number of different problems. What counts as justification? We can have a completely separate discussion about that. Is truth attainable? How do you verify that the truth has been attained? And so justified true belief has some problems, but what it does is it shows that knowledge is a subset of belief. Here's all of the things that I believe, and some of them I'm more convinced of than others, and then there's some subset within there that counts as knowledge. How and why is about that's what the field of epistemology is about, and there are a number of different arguments and I guess schools of thought about what should or shouldn't count as knowledge. My primary concern is not about what people claim as knowledge, but about beliefs. Because you don't wait until you have knowledge to act on your beliefs. You can just barely believe something and that can tip you towards acting on behalf of it. And we always act in accordance with our beliefs. What we find is when we say that we don't act in accordance with our beliefs is that you have beliefs that are competing, and one of them you believe more strongly, or one of them is more important at a particular time. You can say, I believe that as a diabetic I shouldn't eat sugar, but I have other beliefs, which is I enjoy eating sugar things. So it's not that I'm acting in conflict with my beliefs. I just might not be aware of all of my beliefs and which ones are stronger. But beliefs inform actions, and our actions have consequences, and that's why it's important to figure out and care about what people believe, and more importantly, why they believe it. And that's where the burden of proof comes in establishing what should perhaps your default position be, if you can establish a default. How do you go about that? The burden of proof was recently challenged at an ACA lecture, and I'm going to go through a couple of the examples that this individual raised because he was basically arguing that it doesn't help you. Suppose you are exceeding the legally posted speed limit along a road, and there's a curve, and there may or may not be a police officer around that curve, and If you get pulled over, you'd get a ticket, which would slow you down and make you later. If you don't get a ticket, you're going to get to your destination on time. So this was all about risk assessment. And the way he framed the discussion, or the argument, was you can't tell. You don't have enough information to determine whether or not there is, in fact, a police officer up around the corner. And that's where the burden of proof logic doesn't do you any good. You can't establish a default between it. You can't make up a decision. And your inaction, maintaining your same speed, could actually be the worst course of action. He's right. But the burden of proof's not there to help you make a decision between those two things. It's there to demonstrate where a burden of proof rests. And the burden of proof rests on both the claim that a cop is around the corner and the claim that a cop is not around the corner. Meanwhile, whether or not there's an officer around the corner doesn't tell you much about whether or not you're likely to get a ticket. Maybe he's busy doing something else. Maybe you're not going sufficiently fast enough for him to give you a ticket. But none of that matters, because when he started to argue for, hey, the burden of proof doesn't help you in this situation, but here's something who does, he changes the propositions from either there is a cop or there is not a cop around the corner to I should reduce my speed or I should not reduce my speed, and then begins to evaluate evidence wholly manufactured. Every one of the examples, and I hate to cite a lecture that you weren't at, but it may be posted, did this same sort of example. It begins with a position of uncertainty where the propositions seem equally likely, or there is no way to calculate how likely either one of them actually is. Therefore the burden of proof can't help you. And now we need to use a different decision-making theory, at which point he changes the propositions. This is why it's very important to make sure that your propositions are addressed independently. And when you investigate a dichotomy, you investigate a proper dichotomy. So not true-false, but true and not true. The true-false proposition fails, and the prime example of that is the liar's paradox. This statement is false. Well, if it's false, then it's true. And if it's true, then it's false. So it doesn't have a truth value that can be evaluated. So if you claim that the statement is true, you're wrong. And if you claim that the statement is false, you're wrong. But what you can do is evaluate its truth value with respect to true or not true, because the liar's paradox is not true. It's also not false. And that's why when you have competing propositions, they need to be mutually exclusive and all inclusive, which is why it's important to put the not in there. The example about the gumballs, for example, was used. Yes, of course, there's either an even number or an odd number, but the burden of proof doesn't help you decide which of those two you should do. And so he creates a fictional scenario where now, let's make this an important decision, not some trivial one. There's somebody with a gun to your head who wants you to tell them whether it's even or odd. And if you get it right, you live. If you get it wrong, he's going to kill you. And if you refuse to answer, he's going to kill you. And then he proceeds to invent additional evidence of, hey, there's somebody in the audience who yells out it's odd, and I think that they don't want to see me die, and it's maybe they have information, who knows, in order to be able to come up with a solution. So when challenging the burden of proof logic, he was showing that, we're in a situation where we can't possibly know, and the burden of proof doesn't help you. And when showing his better version, he changes all the propositions, because the proposition in that example is no longer, do I believe the number of gumballs is even, or do I believe the number of gumballs is odd? It is now, should I claim that the number of gumballs is even, or should I claim that the number of gumballs is odd? That's a completely separate thing from whether or not you actually believe they are even and odd. This is an equivocation fallacy in pretty much every one of those examples. And it begins with a misunderstanding, because the burden of proof isn't a decision-making tool about whether or not something is reasonable. It just establishes the foundation so that then we can go out and investigate, come up with arguments and evidence, use the scientific methods in order to determine what is in fact reasonable to believe. And so that gets us to Blake's assertion that theism should be the default position. Now, if you remember when we talked about the null hypothesis, the keys to the null hypothesis are that it is something that cannot be demonstrated to be true because of limitations in our ability to investigate or understand. The null hypothesis can't be shown to be true, but it can be shown to be false by demonstrating the truth of a competing hypothesis. If theism, which is the belief that a God exists, were to be the default position, theism is the exact opposite of what we would expect from a null hypothesis. It can, at least in principle, be shown to be true. A God could present themselves to people right here, right now, boom, done. That's the opposite of what we would expect from a null hypothesis. Additionally, it is unfalsifiable. It would require exhaustive knowledge to demonstrate that it is in fact false, which is the opposite of the null hypothesis, which would require exhaustive knowledge to show that it's true. It is the antithesis of what we would rationally normally assume as a default position. The proposition that there isn't a God or that there isn't a supernatural is consistent with a null hypothesis. And if you're going to have default positions that match the theistic proposition or match the same qualities of the theistic proposition, then you're going to find yourself in a position of believing contradictory claims. You have to believe in all the gods and all the gods that could possibly fit within those things. Every proposition that comes along that is on a par with there is a God, you would just have to believe by default. Oh, there are angels, there are demons, there are leprechauns, there are universe-creating pixies, Bigfoot is real, aliens are visiting the earth. All of these things are, just as theism, the exact opposite of what a null hypothesis is and should be. Now, it may be the case that, as I mentioned before, we don't have the ability to establish a default position between two competing claims. But what we always have to do, whether we can establish a default position or not, is acknowledge that there's a default position for a single claim. Some God exists, the default position is to not believe that until such time as it's been demonstrated. Playing cards cause diabetes, the default position is to not believe that until such time as it's been demonstrated. This is how we go about establishing defaults. Your null hypothesis does not have to be between even or odd, true or false. It can be between true or not true. Is this reasonable belief? That's the whole point of establishing a default. That's the whole point of understanding the burden of proof. It's not a tool to help you decide whether or not a specific claim is reasonable. Those tools are science, inquiry, investigation, trying to find out if this claim is consistent with the evidence that we glean from the reality we experience or not. There's a ton of confusion surrounding this burden of proof because we talk about things like, well, I believe this and I'm going to believe it until you prove me wrong. And there's nothing dishonest about that. There's not. There's not anything dishonest about holding on to your position and expecting someone to convince you that you shouldn't hold it. What's dishonest is to hold on to your position, not offer any supporting reasons for your position that someone could potentially debunk and then claim a win. Oh, God exists. I'm not going to tell you why I believe this. Therefore, that you have no hope of showing that I'm wrong because I know you can't prove God doesn't exist. And if I'm not offering you my reasons, you have nothing to address to show that I might in fact be unreasonable on this position. Therefore, I win. That is intellectually dishonest. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.